because in politics, the most fundamental question is always that of what particular human beings have good reason to do, and because what they do have good reason to do depends directly and profoundly on how far they can and should trust and rely upon one another. I take the central issue in political philosophy, properly so called, to be that of how to conceive the rationality of trust in relation to the casual field of politics. In this essay, I discuss the thinking of Locke, firstly because I consider that he made a more systematic and determined effort to think about this question than any other and more recent political philosopher. And secondly, and of course connectedly, because the attempt to think comprehensively about this conception has essentially disappeared from modern political philosophy, both in its Marxist and in its liberal or conservative variants. There are, to be sure, more important analytical idioms in modern thought, such as game theory, and key moments in the construction of particular political theories, such as John Rawls' original position, in which the issue is treated with a great assurance. The explanation of this disappearance is complicated and somewhat obscure matter, and not one suitable for treatment in this context. But that it is so would be difficult to deny. To discuss Locke in this fashion is to not argue that we should today espouse all or any of Locke's own detailed conceptions, but it is implicitly to suggest that we do have good reason to treat his conception of political philosophy as exemplary, as a model which there is still every ground for our trying to emulate. To most modern philosophers, the question, what is the bond of human society, what is the last instance holds it together, will seem a pretty odd one. There is, to be sure, one entire tradition in the modern social theory which is still more or less united in the last instance in the view that what does hold human society together is the indispensability of cooperating in the production of material goods. But this is certainly not intended as a psychological allegation about human dispositions or attitudes, and remains one of the most pressing difficulties of Marxist theory, that its conviction of what does secure the reproduction of human social arrangements is not accompanied by any very clear or cogent explanation of just how and why human agents can be confidently expected to be either disposed to or able to execute the task which the theory assigns to them. When John Locke in his essays on the law of nature described fides as the vinculum societatis, the bond of society, there is no reason to believe that he drew a clear distinction between what he took to be the central virtues or ethical requirements of a good social life and what he took to be the casual explanation of the existence of such a life. At the same time, indeed, he had no particular reason to think especially hard about the latter question. Modern thinkers, by contrast, are inclined to separate out these two questions with some completeness, often electing to confine themselves solely to considering either the internal relations of a set of ethical concepts or the political sociology of the conditions for reproducing a particular regime or mode of production. Those who are interested predominantly in explaining the reproduction of a particular social and political patterns would not, on the whole, be inclined to look for answers at the psychological level. A partial explanation would be Barrington Moore's explanation of the historical record of human passivity in the face of injustice in terms of imaginative habituation eked out by rational pessimism. Even if they were prepared to essay a psychological account of the cement of human society, most modern social thinkers would probably offer a fairly variegated list of contributory factors: greed, fear, lust, conviviality, habit, hope, despair, indolence, an extremely high degree of selective inattention, and so on. The most famous single criticism of Locke's political philosophy, and in some measure of the entire contractarian tradition, is David Hume's attack on the Treatise of Human Nature, and more particularly in his essay Of the Original Contract, on the absurdity of any attempt to resolve the obligation of allegiance into the obligation of fidelity, to explain political obligation by invoking the duty to keep promises. There is, in my view, abundant doubt as to how far Locke himself did intend to explain political obligation through the duty to keep promises, and more particularly as to how far he regarded personal consent as a precondition for valid political obligation. But what is true is that his moral and political thinking as a whole, and indeed the central burden of his philosophical thinking in its entirety, was directed towards an understanding of the rationality and moral propriety of human trust. The purpose of this essay is to try to show how and why this preoccupation dominated his thinking, to show that it was and is a coherent preoccupation, and to suggest that modern political philosophy has not gained but lost from its fiducious and Fitzgerald avoidance of such gross and promiscuously constituted issues. Scrupulous, that's the word. And I take it that to the extent my purpose is successfully realized, what could reasonably be drawn from the line of argument is, in the first place, a fairly robust understanding of the integrity and force of a past piece of philosophical thinking of very high quality, and secondly, and much more tentatively, and not necessarily altogether flattering perspective on the tacit framing of much political philosophy in our own day. The rationality of trust within particular structures of social and political relations is a pressing issue in political understanding in any society of the modern world. It features predominantly and pertinently enough in the characteristic analyses of the politics of the communist states constructed by Western scholars, just as it does in those of capitalist states developed by Marxist scholars. It's a salient preoccupation of such ambitious essays in the theoretical assessment of modern society, and that it travails as that of Jürgen Habermas. But as far as I know, the only major social theorist has recently chosen to consider it directly. The German functionalist sociologist Niklas Luhmann published 10 years ago a lengthy synthetic essay on the problem of trust in modern society. Some of the main lines of thought set out in this work offer an instructive contrast to Locke's approach. Like Locke, Luhmann sees trust as central to understanding a society in operation. Like Locke again, he sees trust as making possible a massive extension of men's capacity to cooperate, not by means of cognitively rational calculation, but through the provision of a measure of buffering between indispensable hopes and expectations which are necessarily partially disappointed. Trust fundamentally is a technique for coping with the freedom of other human beings, for extending the availability of time and thus rendering possible the choice of delayed gratification, for increasing men's tolerance of uncertainty, for the contrafactual stabilization of expectations. Without trust, confidence in their own expectations of others, men or women could scarcely nerve themselves to get up in the morning. The working of all complex or economic institutions, government bureaucracies, or monetary systems depends directly upon trust, at least in part on trust generated in the more intimate and cognitively accessible context of which each human being's everyday life. Luhmann's book does not present a particularly bold and clear line of thought, but it does extend this range of judgments, any or all of which Locke might have well shared in one distinctive direction, a direction dictated by Luhmann's emphatic commitment to a functional conception of society. Modern society, Luhmann believes, depends less on normative experiences and more on purely cognitive assumptions than did their historical predecessors. The contrafactual stabilization of experience is the function of normative experience. This function is less central to modern societies because of the degree to which these require for their working not emotional trust, known and familiar persons, but system trust predicated on the ways in which institutions, practices, and the incumbents of distinct rules present themselves to us. Individual trust is seldom reflexive in its base, founded upon trust in the viability of trust itself, but confidence in economic institutions such as particular currency is characteristically grounded in this way. Because of this sharp change in the balance between emotional and presentational, between direct and systemic, trust in the operations of earlier societies and those of today, issues of the rationality of trust today depend for their assessment predominantly on the casual analysis of society, and thus cannot be handled by an ethical theory of the appropriate criteria for the allocation of individual trust. This view of the part played by cognitive apprehension of and instrumentally rational response to social causality, in cementing social cooperation, sociologically more plausible in relation to the Federal Republic of Germany in the late 1960s than, for example, to Great Britain in the early 1980s. But however questionable its sociological judgments, it does not indicate one strong contrast between modern social thought and the perspective of Locke, the very limited extent to which the latter's conceptions of rational and moral conduct for individuals or groups in particular contexts depend upon explicit judgments of the casual properties of societies or of particular social institutions. One of the judgments defended here is that despite the indispensability of the causal analysis of society, there is considerably more than we normally recognize today to be said for the pre-modern Lockean perspective on this question. Its most important merit is the directness with which it addresses the question of just what particular human beings, ourselves included, have good reason to do. A great deal of modern political philosophy, whether utilitarian or Kantian or in its moral inspiration, gives very arbitrary or uncertain amounts of how, in a particular historical situation or any particular agent has good reason to act. There are, of course, many other types of this question which require an answer in political philosophy. But because of the historically given character of political conflict and political power, and the consequent need for conclusions of political philosophy to intrude themselves into existing fields of force and meaning, no adequate political philosophy can simply take the form of a theory of what is intrinsically desirable. It cannot, in the last instance, because the question desirable for whom is a prototypically political question. At the very least, any such theory must also offer an account of what sort of claims, in the face of what sorts of costs the intrinsically desirable can rationally levy upon individual historical agents or groups of such agents. If these claims constitute if these claims constitute at all a heavy burden, it must add at least a stretch of the reasons why such agents would themselves be epistemically well advised to regard the claims as valid. Sounded good. Two powerful imaginative tendencies have made it particularly hard to generate such reasons today. One, plainly, is the rather steady pressure of moral skepticism, motivated essentially by the contrast between the presumed epistemic solidity of human understanding and of non-human nature, and the cognitively relatively whimsical status of judgments of human value. The second is the increasingly alienated vision of the nature of human societies and polities, which have developed over the last 2.5 centuries. If the entire field of political social relations surrounding the individual agent is taken as a given, and his or her potential contribution to politics is then assessed in purely instrumental terms, virtually all political action will appear as necessarily futile, and the balance between comparatively certain and highly uncertain gain will become prohibitively discouraging to political agency. This is not the place to try to take the measure of either of these imaginative pressures. But I mention them briefly at this point because they do press so hard on all of us, because in the realm of politics at least, their conjunction is obviously culturally malign. John Locke wrestled for 40 years with the problems presented by the first, the epistemic status of moral judgments, but for reasons which I shall try to make clear, he was never compelled to face the menace of the second. The failure of his attempts to rebut moral skepticism mean that we can hardly today employ his philosophy to order, discipline, and sustain our own fondest political institutions. But the boldness with which he conceived human societies as historical creations for which their members can and should always try to assume an active responsibility can perhaps be of some real aid. Certainly, in my view, it holds a better and wider balance between agent responsibility and external social and political causality than any other political philosopher or political scientist of the last century has managed to achieve. I turn now to the development of Locke's thinking about the place of trust in human life, and consider firstly the justly famous letter written in his late 20s to an unnamed friend, probably Thomas Westrow. It is the most striking expression of moral skepticism that Locke has ever penned. Passion and fancy, not reason, rule human life. Human beings select their beliefs to suit their desires, and rational argument has little, if any, power to alter them. Quote, men live upon trust, and in their knowledge is nothing but opinion molded up between custom and interest. There are two great luminaries of the world, the only lights they walk by, unquote. The diagnosis of this predicament is lengthier, more eloquent, and considerably more definite than the remedies which are suggested to meet it. Custom and interest are uncertain and fickle guides, and the conclusions which they suggest are surprisingly conventional. Quote, "Let the examples of the bravest men direct our opinions and actions. If custom must guide us, let us tread in those steps that lead us to virtue and honor. Let us make it our interest to honor our Maker, and be useful to our fellows, and content with ourselves. This, if it will not secure us from error, will keep us from losing ourselves. If we walk not directly straight, we shall not be altogether in a maze." Unquote. Apart from the somewhat erratic pragmatism of the proposed attitude towards the deity, the stalwart conventionality of the recommended response stands in its remarked contrast with the existential urgency of the predicament itself. As agents, human beings make their own selves, but they do so in circumstances and out of materials emphatically not of their own choosing, because they have such good reason to distrust the materials with which they must work and the beliefs on the basis of which they must act, and because so much of their lives necessarily depends upon custom and habitual expectation. Only the clearest conceptions of virtue, held imaginatively at some distance from the immediate importunities of their own lives, can exercise a benign directive pressure upon these. To continue to act at all, men must be able to trust, believe with confidence, but they can hope to form beliefs which epistemically deserve their trust only by a settled and unrelenting suspicion of their own motives, and a steady contemplation of ethical models which are wholly independent to their own immediate desires. In Locke's first extended writing on politics, the two tracts of the early 1660s dealing with the extent of a magistrate's legislative authority over indifferent things, actions neither directly commanded nor directly forbidden by God's law, the issue of trust does not explicitly arise. The magistrate's authority derives immediately from the will of God. Quote, "God wished there to be order, society, and government among men, and this we call the commonwealth. In every commonwealth there must be some supreme power without which it cannot truly be called a commonwealth, and that supreme power is exactly the same in all governments, namely legislative." Unquote. It's not clear that any such power over human life could in principle derive its authority simply from the consent of men. Not only is political power indispensable for human security, it is also compelled by this very indispensability to determine its own scope and practice, since the partiality of individual human judgment and the geographical and cultural variety of men's evaluations precludes their being left to determine its scope in the light of their own individual beliefs. Our deformity is others' beauty. Our rudeness is our others' civility, and there is nothing so uncouth and unhandsome to us which doth not somewhere or other find applause and approbation. I'm not reading the rest of this chapter.